Wabash Carnegie Public Library Oral History Program interviewing Warren S. Pressler, 519 Crown Hill Drive East, Wabash, Indiana, Wednesday, June 4th, 1975. This interview is conducted by George Dingledy. Warren, the first question I'm going to ask, tell me first of all about your parents and yourself and your grandparents and so forth.
To my grandparents, I know nothing about them except my grandfather, Tom Simmons, was a Democratic postmaster in Wabash, of course, years and years ago. He's the only one I know anything about.
Well, how about your mother and father then? Tell me about.
My father was in the Civil War and was wounded in the Civil War, but he came out of it fairly good shape and lived in Germantown, Ohio, and came out to Indiana in 1865 in a covered wagon. I think he had about $15 in his pocket, and he settled 6 miles south of Wabash and lived there the rest of his life. And when he died, he was 80 years old. My mother died when I was an infant, and my father sent to Wilmington, Ohio to get a housekeeper, and he finally married her, and she reared me.
What was your mother's, her maiden name?
My own mother, Simmons, S-E-M-A-N-S.
What year were you born in?
1891.
Did he ever tell you any of his experiences during the Civil War?
Yes, a few, but Dad didn't. He would talk about it much. He always thought that whatever he told, people would look out the window and not very much interested. And I have found the same thing, so I never talk about it. People have an awful time. And it isn't because I'm modest. I'm everything else but modest.
Did you help around the farm?
No.
Never?
No, I didn't. Dad didn't want me to be a farmer. He didn't want me to learn it.
Where did you go to school as a little boy?
I went to grade school across from the Dunkard Church. The Dunkard Church south of Wabash on 13. There was a grade school there. Then I went to Wabash High School and then DePaul Preparatory School. And then I went to the Army.
Was this a one-room school, the grade school?
Oh, yes.
Do you have fond memories of the one-room schoolhouse?
Oh, I couldn't recommend it very highly, but then I think sometimes that we did better than some of the children are doing now from what I read.
Yeah. And how did you happen to wind up in the Army then?
Well, I went to Buffalo and took flying lessons out at Curtis Field and soloed there in 1917.
What type of planes and the things?
In a Curtis Curtis JN4 with an OX-5 engine. Wonderful old plane in those days. And then I went to France.
You went right straight from there into the Air Force?
Mm-hmm,
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Did you feel like you were qualified at the time?
Yes, I had confidence. Qualified, I don't know, but I had confidence.
Had you already signed up for the Air Corps at that time?
No, but I had been in Buffalo, tied in with a squadron there that was getting ready to go to Canada as a Satterfield Escadrille. You're familiar with the Lafayette Escadrille. Well, this man, Captain Satterfield, very wealthy man from Buffalo, and I mean extremely wealthy. And he was equipping us fellows. He paid for our flying lessons, and he was qualifying and equipping us to go to France as a Satterfield Escadrille. And in the meantime, the America in 1917 got into the war, and they refused to accept us as a unit.
So what did you do then?
Just joined the Air Force.
Was there much formality to get into the Air Force after you had all this training? And
my father and Senator Jim Watson were good friends. Dad was kind of a politician. He was Wabash County Commissioner for, I think, 4 terms, which is quite unusual in those days. Yeah. He was a very good friend of Senator Jim Watson. So when I wanted to get in the Air Service, I just got on the train and went to Washington and went into Jim Watson's office and told him that I wanted to get in the Air Service. And he took me over to Captain Larner's office and said, "Here's a friend of mine that wants to get in the Air Service, and I want him in it." And that's all there was to it. I was in the next day.
Had you flown any before you went to Buffalo?
No.
Never flown in an airplane?
No.
I would imagine that an airplane was even a rare sight in Wabash County.
I don't think they'd ever seen a half a dozen. I did some barnstorming around Indiana before I went to France. They used to land, and I'd land out in the clover field, and they used to come running out. Some of them the first plane they'd ever seen down south.
Were you barnstorming by yourself, or was this a troop of?
In the Army.
The Army.
Recruiting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Was that good duty?
No, I wanted to go to France.
Well, when did you finally get your wish to go to France?
I got in touch with Senator Watson again, told him I wanted to go to France, and went over in the early fall of 1917.
How did you get to France, and what were the procedures and so forth?
Sent home on furlough. I was home 2 or 3 days and got a wire to report to Mineola, Long Island for overseas duty. And of course I immediately took a train to New York, went out to Mineola and boarded the Manchuria. Sailed for, landed in England, crossed the channel. The crossing channel was worse than fighting the Germans.
And then what field were you assigned to in France?
First, tours. Tours, tour, for acrobat, then, well, might say a refreshment course, and then Issoudun for acrobatics, and then to Clermont-Ferrand for bombing.
And how long did this training take?
We were up on the front in January.
What was the life in training? What was that like? Very formal or?
Oh, I can't say it wasn't formal.
Yeah.
We had no military training. They have it now, but
Yes.
we had none.
Well, how about the training for acrobatics and bombing and that? Had they developed any structured course of instruction or?
No, they had a certain procedure they put you through, Immelman turns, and that in case of combat you use an Immelman. An Immelman Immelman was a German, and he's supposed to be in the first one that ever did the Immelman turn. If you're going east, you pull up, you're headed west, but you're on your back, so you roll and you're headed west. You can change direction the quickest of any other way, quicker than going into a bank.
What kind of planes were you using when you got to France then?
Newport.
Single seat?
Oh yes, they washed them out. They were rotary engines,
Right.
and they were dangerous. They caught fire. You couldn't throttle the gas in a rotary. You had to cut out cylinders. There were 9 cylinders, and you'd cut out 3, and then coming in. Then when you get ready to come in, edge of the field, you cut out 3 more. You'd come in, pop, 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 and if you'd overshoot the field, you'd cut those cylinders back in. In the meantime, they'd filled with gas. It didn't happen very often, but once in 1,000 landings was too much. So they blew up and caught fire. So they washed them out.
Now, what were you using for instructors?
When we first got to tour, we had French instructors, but Issoudun had American instructors.
Yeah. Had these men been in combat?
No.
They had never been in combat
No,
either?
not to my knowledge. The war hadn't been on to have anybody in combat. They didn't have any planes. The Americans didn't have any planes over there.
Were you afraid of the equipment that you saw when you got there, or
No.
still
no.
didn't bother you?
We were too young. I would be today. I'd
Yeah.
scared to death. We weren't afraid of anything. We were too young. We didn't know enough to be afraid. You know what I mean.
Yeah. And then finally, when do you get into duty, flying?
There were several of us that went up with the British, some actual experience, and I was with the British 55th, bombing the Rhine Valley. We were flying DH-9s with Rolls-Royce engines, and I was glad to get away from them. Wonderful bunch of fellas, but they had to talk about nerve. They didn't have a nerve in their body. If they'd get into combat with a German plane, that German was scared to death. They were going to ram him.
Yeah.
They did. I didn't see it happen, but it did happen.
How did the bombing operation work? How did they know when to drop the bombs? And was it all by sight?
Yes, all by sight.
How high were you flying in those days?
When I got back to the American squadron, we had French brigades with Renault engines. Our limit with a load of bombs was 10 to 12,000 feet, but it might as well be down as you just didn't have as far to fall in case you were shot down.
Yeah.
Because the anti-aircraft was very ineffective. That's the only thing. The only reason we'd go to 10 or 12,000 was to get away from anti-aircraft.
Yeah.
But the Germans couldn't hit the side of a barn with anti-aircraft if you got above 6,000 or 8,000 feet.
Were they using parachutes in those days?
No, we never. The balloons had parachutes, but we never had a parachute. No.
Well, what happened after you were with this British squadron? What was your next move?
Back to the American squadron that came up on the front with these French planes.
And who was your commanding officer and some of the...
Major Brown was our first commanding officer, and he was shot down. We lost 5 planes on July the 10th in 1918, and he was one of them. Then we got another Major Dunsworth as a commanding officer. Major Brown was a wonderful fellow. Dunsworth was so-so.
What was your mission?
Bombing.
What place?
Gondricourt, Longuyon, and different places where there were German troops or German ammunition dumps and so forth. Come down in a power dive and machine gun on the way down. But we knew they were shooting at us, and we'd get all the speed that those old planes would stand, so when we'd pull out, the wings didn't fold. We had terrific speed, and they'd misjudge our speed and shoot through our tails.
What is terrific speed? I mean, in those days?
175, depend on the plane. The old Spad would peaked to 250.
What kind of accommodations did you have?
We lived back behind the lines, and we had our officers' mess, and we lived well.
Did your squadron have a name also then?
The 96-day bombardment.
Yeah.
Our squadron was the first bombing squadron on the front. Came up, they were flying Liberties with D-84s with a Liberty engine. Whoever sent those Liberty planes and engines over to France would be court-martialed.
Did you stay with this bombardment group all through the war?
Until October of 1918.
And then what happened?
I was incapacitated.
What happened?
I went down up near Grand Pre. I just don't care to go into it. Up near Grand Pre, beyond Verdun. I shot down.
You want to tell me the details?
That's all there was to it. My motor, I wasn't hit. My motor was, and I had no flying power.
Did you land the plane then? And
in the woods.
hit any trees?
Oh yeah, and hung up in one for a while.
Yeah. How badly were you hurt?
Oh, just a leg broken and an arm, few just scratches here and there. I'm not being modest. I just don't like to talk about
it. Well, I think that this is important to what we're doing. I think.
Oh well.
Yeah. How did you get out, and did someone come after you and rescue you?
Finally, where I landed, a few hours before, it had been no man's land, but it was during an offensive, and the Americans had driven the Germans on back. And I landed up in right close to a bunch of American infantrymen.
And they saved you, and...
Yeah, got me down in good shape, anyhow. Of course, I went to the hospital.
Where? What hospital did you...
New Chateau.
And how long were you recuperating then?
Oh, about 3 months. It was just a month before the war was over.
After you recovered, then what happened from the leg and the arm injury?
I went down to Nice, recuperating, really having a good time. They called it recuperating. And then I got home in April, I believe, of 1919.